future for Indian AI startups, both for applications and the AI infrastructure layer. At the infrastructure layer, I think there's room to build indigenous foundation models rather than relying on these to develop them. And the second is to build easy to adopt applications that were previously infeasible to do now that you have AI, but they address the global market overall. So, and then I think more exciting on the application layer side, the opportunity I think is twofold. One is to build applications that do what was previously infeasible for unique problems for the Indian market. Today, I'd like to talk to you about AI opportunities specifically for Indian startups, and then kind of how I think about finding the next big opportunity in the age of AI. I'm not intimately familiar with the Indian startup scene, so forgive me if there's things that may not be entirely on point, but I think I'm trying to provide a high-level framework for how to think about opportunities here. And my hope is that by the end of this talk, I'd like you to be better informed about what AI startup idea you should work on. And I know some of you may already be working on startup ideas, so maybe this will help you better focus what you're working on. In either case, I hope that this kind of helps you ideate in terms of what you may want to work on for your startup. So as a quick outline of the talk, I'll tell you more about myself, both as an operator and an investor. Varun mentioned some of my background there. And then I'll talk a little bit about startup challenges that I've seen, especially in the AI space for companies both in the US and India, respectively. And then we'll talk about where some of the opportunities are for Indian startups. I'll introduce a concept and a framework that I put together called the zone of infeasibility and how that applies to AI apps. And then we'll wrap up with some inspirational case studies and examples of opportunities for AI in the Indian market. And hopefully this will give you some food for thought in terms of where you'd like to focus on next. Great. So I just want to start off in saying that startups are hard. They're hard work. I've done the 0 to 1 startup journey about 5 or 6 times now, and they're hard because there's just so much unknown that you don't often find out the true answer to until you're deep into it. And that's why it's no matter how educated and informed you are, it's hard to know kind of the where the startup is going to go. So, but I think it can be made easier, and that can be made easier by having some deliberation up front, being thoughtful about the direction you take, and the problems that you decide to focus on, and the markets you decide to serve from the outset. And so I'm hoping in today's talk, I'll give you a little bit of framework on how to think about that to kind of de-risk the startup from the outset, and specifically with the AI lens on top of it. So first, let's talk about some of the challenges for US and AI startups, and then we'll talk about the opportunities from there. So in the US, the challenges are a little different than India. I think I kind of reflected on 3 primary challenges here. The first is that the market is highly saturated. So there's just a lot of overinvestment. I mean, it is in some ways a bubble, especially for the AI space. And there's a lot of startups and a lot of great talent all competing for like the same slice of the pie. So any idea that you're focused on, there's probably 5 startups that are well capitalized focusing on the same thing. And because there's so much investment, there's also a high cost for talent. And then the third piece, I think, is that there's also some regulation risk. The US is pretty lax compared to the European Union, but there still are privacy regulations that you have to be mindful of, and there's impending or in future regulations around AI that I think startups have to be considerate of. For Indian startups, I think the challenges are different here. So the first is I think there's a gap in terms of so far, India is kind of behind kind of the U.S. and the West in terms of developing AI infrastructure and foundational models, and I think this stems from not having enough investment in foundational academic research, and the lack of kind of investors making big bets on these types of startups. There are a number of emerging startups that I'll talk about that I think are now taking this on in India, but this has been a gap so far from my perspective. And if you look at the investor ecosystem in India, I think investors tend to be a little less risky and less eager to deploy early stage capital. And then there's also kind of the brain drain factor. I think this is changing in India, but especially for AI, a lot of folks go to the US for graduate school and then end up staying there, which I think is to India's detriment in some regards. And then, unlike traditional cloud computing, AI is expensive to run. And so, for a price sensitive market like India, if you're trying to reach the masses, that's something you have to be cognizant of and limits kind of the applications for AI. This, is often cited as a big gap for India and digital literacy. I actually don't see it as a big gap for India. I kind of see this as an opportunity, but I put it on the side because people often talk about digital literacy as a gap in India. And I think the opportunity here is that AI can actually help the market kind of transcend a lot of these literacy gaps. This could be both in terms of reading literacy, or they could be digital literacy, because AI enables natural language interfaces, either through chat or voice, so that you don't actually need to know how to read or actually operate like a device in many ways. So I see this actually as a big opportunity here. And then the last piece is, I think, right now a lot of Indian startups are reliant on foundational models developed abroad, and they're subjected to the biases that are inherent in how these models were trained. So just to give you an example, Meta, a lot of their models are trained actually off of Bible verses. And the reason Meta chose to do this is that is the largest source of parallel corpora across 4,000 languages. And so, it's I don't think they're trying to build in biases, but there are inherent biases in here in terms of how the meanings of words and the interpretation and language choice as well. So that's just something that's the current state today. So with that, I want to talk about kind of where I see the opportunity spaces for AI startups in India. So I broadly break up AI startups into being in one of these two categories. So the first are AI and infrastructure startups that I kind of define as they're either building hardware or software that powers AI applications. And it provides value not to end users, but to AI engineers. And the AI engineers from there can then build applications. So an example of this in the US, maybe Grok, this is building AI hardware for fast inference. OpenAI, of course, building foundational models, or it could be a layer above that. So, like Databricks, for example, building software for LLM ops. The second category are more AI applications. And so the definition I have here is these are companies that are actually building software that provides value to end users. In some cases, these companies are building their own models. And in other cases, they're fine tuning foundational models. In other cases, they're simply wrappers over existing foundational models. But the commonality across all of these is that the end user is not an AI engineer. They're kind of a end user who's trying to derive business or consumer value, and they're often non-technical as a persona. So for Indian startups, I think in large part the opportunity lies on the right side with AI applications, because building differentiated AI infrastructure takes a lot of research innovation, large amounts of capital, and it's definitely possible in India, and there are startups taking this on that I'll talk about. But it's not where I think most Indian startups are likely to stand out. And we'll talk about some of these exceptions, but for the next section's talk, let's just go forward with the premise on double clicking and zooming in on the opportunity for AI applications. So keeping AI applications in mind, I want to kind of now look at where the opportunity is for that in India. And so before we look at AI applications, um, I, I think it's helpful to look at the previous generation of non-AI startups and where they've succeeded, and then map that to AI. So for that, I've put together this 2x2 framework here. So on one axis, um, we have where which market these companies are serving. So if a startup is serving the Indian market, it'd be India. If they're serving the U.S. market, it's here as U.S. And then on the bottom would be the company origin. So where was the company actually founded? Was it founded in India, or was it founded in the U.S.? And so if we look at it through this lens here, we can start to notice some patterns. So the first thing here I have is companies that are based in the U.S. and serving the U.S. market, and and I just listed one representative example, Salesforce, which isn't a startup anymore, but they're kind of indicative of a lot of the qualities that I see of companies that are in the U.S. serving the U.S. market. And so I think the commonality here is that these span both the consumer and B2B use cases, but they often will be enterprise use cases. And the reason why is enterprise use cases require understanding enterprise customers really well. And in order to do that, you need to have almost like a physical presence and be very close with the customers in the U.S. In some cases, these startups will require heavy R&D investment, which is typically only available in the U.S. And these startups don't expand to India specifically. They may have some customers here, but they're focused more on global kind of use cases and enterprises. So they're kind of the first movers. They'll carve out a brand new market segment altogether and focus on kind of global or US specific markets here. The next bucket are Indian startups serving the domestic Indian market. And I think these companies have succeeded because they are solving uniquely Indian problems. These could be things that involve localization, they could involve logistical issues, and that's what creates a differentiated moat from other companies from abroad displacing them. And they've typically addressed consumer use cases, and that's not always the case. But two examples that come to mind are Razorpay and Zomato here. The third quadrant are U.S. companies that are serving the Indian market, and these companies often enter as second movers. So they're not the first one in the Indian market. There's already usually a domestic Indian indigenous startup focusing on this, and then they kind of come in and start displacing them. So in the case of Uber, it'd be displacing Ola, Flipkart displacing Flipkart, Amazon displacing Flipkart, and Google has displaced a whole host of Indian startups. I remember maybe 15 years ago, there's a search engine called Guruji.com that Google displaced in the mapping sector, Map My India. So they're kind of second movers, but because of just how much clout they have and resources, they're able to displace some of the startups that don't have a good differentiator. And then the fourth quadrant are Indian startups serving the U.S. market, and I think these are fewer in number, but they're pretty impressive. And the commonality here is that they're building a lower cost product in some ways that's easier to use than an enterprise version of a product, and they're able to attract users through product-led growth. So people are able to kind of more self-serve without having a heavy sales engagement, and they're able to use those products on their own and kind of if you look at here, Freshworks and Zoho are two standout examples where they are lightweight clones of more enterprise accounting and CRM software, and they're targeting like the lower end of B2B businesses. So looking at this chart, I think the opportunities for Indian startups are on the left side here. They're really where Indian startups, where they're either building for domestic needs or they're building for global needs, but they are kind of second movers and they're able to build an easier to use product in many ways. So with that premise in mind, I think the key questions to ask for each of these to kind of figure out what to work on would be for the first bucket here. This is for companies that are serving the U.S. market. They're building like a second version of an existing product and displacing a kind of an incumbent in there for maybe a lower tier market segment. So what is a well understood product in the US that I can create for a lower tier market segment that's self-serve and easier to use? So that's, I think, the key question asked for here. The second one is what problems are unique to the Indian market and what US tech startup is hard to replicate in India? How can they build a moat such that they cannot kind of displace me? And just having market presence alone in India, I think, is not enough to kind of build a moat against a US tech startup because they're often very well capitalized. So Amazon, for example, Flipkart, already had a lot of market penetration, but Amazon or Uber, they have enough capitalization that they can come in and displace people. So you need something a little more India specific to kind of be defensible against that. So hope this makes sense so far. So from here, I want to dive into this framework called the zone of infeasibility. That's a little more AI specific. So keeping in mind that the premise that we're focused on applications, so AI apps versus kind of AI infrastructure, and we're focusing on building products that either serve the Indian market or serve the U.S. market with this lens in mind. Let's talk about the zone of infeasibility and the AI opportunity here. So traditionally, software interfaces, they have walked this tightrope where you either have to choose whether you want simplicity and low functionality or complexity and kind of more powerful high functionality. And if you look at this graph here, this kind of depicts it here. So you have kind of casual users down here. These are people who are not experts, and so they need like a more user friendly, simple design, but they can't do as much with it. It's relatively like less powerful technology. Or you have power users who need high functionality, but then the interfaces get more and more complex. And so traditionally, software has kind of traversed this orange band here, where you can't really veer too far away from here. And we'll talk more about this and the opportunity for AI here. So here's some examples, I think, of different types of software and where there's, one piece of software built for casual users, another for power users that are essentially serving the same use case. So if you look at graphic design, Photoshop is for power users. Canva came in and built a product for casual users. Music production, you have like GarageBand that ships on Macs, and then like more professional software like Ableton Live. And you can just go down this and kind of see that for everything, there's like a counterpart that serves the more complex use case here. And so if we visualize the same graphic in four quadrants, you can see for casual users, the software that's low usability but low functionality, it's often easy to use and intuitive. It supports basic operations. It's for non-technical users. And then on the other end, you have high usability. Sorry, this should actually be inverted here. To say high usability, low usability. So these are harder to use software. They can do arbitrarily complex operations. They often have interfaces like APIs rather than like a visual interface. And these are usable only by technical or expert users. And an example of this would be like a marketing user who's learned SQL. They can do this, but if you haven't learned SQL, then you have to use maybe like a visual interface here that can't do as much. And then we get to the two interesting zones. So this is like the zone of what I call the zone of infeasibility. These are products that are easy to use, but they can support very complex operations. And casual users can use them and do things that uh, only power users previously could do, or power users can do them to do things very easily that would otherwise take them a lot of time. And then on the bottom right is what I call the zone of undesirability. No one wants to build products here, and if they do, they don't survive. These are products that are hard to use and don't do much. Um, and so like examples, there are examples here. So like a lot of in the U.S. or India, I think government designed websites, they're just hard to use and they don't do much, but they're able to survive because they have like a monopoly. You kind of have to use them. As product design today, if we look at it for both casual and power users, there's a couple of different buckets. So there's casual UI only. So this is a single interface for casual users, often only supports kind of consumer or small and medium business use cases. And they often lose market share to competitors who are doing more complex use cases. There's also people who are building power user interfaces only. So this is a single user interface for more complex use cases, typically serving the enterprise, and they will often lose share to competitors focused on the more simpler use cases. It's hard to span the whole spectrum. But one approach is to have a dual mode UI. So you'll see on occasion some products, they'll have two user interfaces that serve both casual users, one for casual users, one for power users, but the same underlying product. So we'll look at a few examples of each of these. It'll make a little more sense here. So as I mentioned earlier, if you look at just graphic design, the first example here is like Adobe. So they have, I think, around $12 billion in revenue for Photoshop, and Photoshop is really catering to power users such as graphic designers. But doing so left a big hole in the market, and that let Canva come in and capture market share for the lower tier. So they have probably around $1 billion a year in revenue, and they're targeting the same application, graphic design, but it's more for casual users. So it could be marketing teams, it could be small businesses. And so essentially serving the same market, but two different interfaces essentially for doing the same thing. You could also do an example of dual mode UI. So this one is probably one you've used. So Google, for example, they have their casual UI, which is just a search box, and 99% of search volume probably goes through here. But for the 1% of power users, they also have this other interface where you can then do much more complex queries in here. There's also like different search operators that you can use in the normal search box. So it's the same product, but they have kind of a dual split user interface for interacting with it to cater to both casual users and more advanced users as well. This at my own startup, Kiara, we also adopted the same philosophy. We were selling to marketers, and so a lot of them didn't understand kind of Boolean expressions and all of that logic. So we have this kind of simple kind of chip-based interface here, and then we had the same. You could represent the same query in a more complex manner and allow them to use more advanced operations. So how do casual users traditionally get access to like power functionality? It's either by upskilling. So this could be like someone learning to they essentially become an expert or power user by learning how to do so. So a business user could learn how to use SQL, but that takes a lot of effort and it takes a long time to do so. Or they can partner, so they can work with an expert and have them do the work for them. So, for example, if you're a marketing user and you want a complex graphic design, you could work with a graphic designer, professional graphic designer, to design it for you. There's obviously a cost to this. Often it's hard to get hold of the experts. There's context switching, so maybe more in a data science context. Data scientists want to build a production machine learning pipeline. They have to go talk to ML engineer or data engineer and really get them to work with them. But in the transfer of getting their knowledge that they built in a notebook to the data engineer, often things get lost in translation. So there's a friction in the context switching. So just a few examples of like partnering. A product manager may want to ask a data analyst to generate a report, so they have to go and ask, the data analyst to run this for them. I mentioned the example of a marketing manager designing a more complex graphic, or a marketer wants to draft a privacy policy. They have to go to a legal resource to do so. So all of these require, asking an expert to do that specific task. And so, as I mentioned, the downsides here are that context transfer, things get messed up in that process. Also, those experts are limited resource. They're in high demand, and it's hard to get them. There's often delays associated with that. So the real opportunity, I think, for generative AI applications is to kind of penetrate that zone of infeasibility. And this is really, I think, historically never been possible. And it allows casual users to do power functionality, act like a power user without actually having to learn the software and do that. Or it allows power users to do things much more efficiently and be more productive. And so we'll walk through some examples here. So what generative AI unlocks is high functionality for casual users. So casual users can now do very complex tasks. They don't have to learn how to use specialized software. They don't even have to go and ask the power users to do so. So example would be like automatic dashboard generation for a product manager, or any of the examples here, for example. So you can imagine a generative AI application where a product manager can generate reports on their own. A marketing manager can use DALI, for example, to generate a more complex graphic. A marketer could use LLM-based application to generate privacy policy. They no longer need to go to like a legal resource to do so. Or on the other side, you have power users who are able to do things much more efficiently. So a common example here are like co-pilots. So GitHub Copilot is probably the most widely adopted example here. So power users, they're still doing the same job. It's not like they have more functionality and they're able to do more than what they're previously able to do. It's just that they're able to do it much more efficiently. So like code completion or automatic refactoring or automatically writing unit tests, they could do that before. It's just now all of a sudden it's way more efficient for them to do so. So looking at the lens of what generative AI unlocks for AI applications, I kind of place into one of these two camps here. And a few examples here. So one, this is a company that I've gotten to know over the past year called Virtual Staging AI. And in the US, when people list homes for sale on Zillow or Redfin, it's often very attractive to show a furnished home versus an empty home. And so what they'll do is they'll stage it. So a couple of ways you can do this. So one is you can actually rent furniture like that looks nice. Probably may not be furniture you'd use, but it looks nice. So you actually rent it and you place it in the apartment or home. You take pictures, you upload that online, and then as people tour the home, they'd also see it with that staged furniture. And that's often pretty expensive because you're renting the furniture month after month until you make a sale. Another way of doing this is more virtually. So there are some firms that are pretty large where they have teams of people who are like Photoshop experts. You take photos of your home, they'll automatically go and Photoshop fancy furniture in your home. And so for your virtual listing, it all of a sudden looks very attractive. And so this has been the traditional approach to like making home listings look well. And so this company spun out of Harvard. It's called Virtual Staging AI, and they have trained their own generative models. And the first thing the generative model can do is actually remove furniture from a room. So I could take a picture of like a room with my existing furniture in here. I don't have to move it all out of my home, and they'll actually remove the furniture visually from there. And then they'll then kind of invert that process with their generative model and add attractive looking furniture into there, and you can prompt it to do so. And so this company, they went from building from prototype to 1 million ARR in 10 months, and they're well past that mark. So this example of uh, penetrating that zone of infeasibility where real estate agents or just anyone putting out their home up for sale, previously they'd have to go and ask an expert. They'd have to go ask an interior designer to go place furniture in there and take photos, or they'd have to go ask people who know Photoshop to go and add this furniture in there. But now all of a sudden they can just in a few seconds do it themselves. So this is on the diagram that we looked at, enabling casual users to have power capabilities all of a sudden. So next, want to talk about some Indian AI startups working on uniquely Indian problems with this lens. So if that makes sense about like penetrating the zone of infeasibility, I want to talk about some startups that are kind of doing that, and then just more broadly, kind of exciting Indian AI startups. They're focusing, I think, on exclusively Indian problems that I think have some level of defensibility because they're doing so. So this is from a previous era. This is a app called Where's My Train that some of you may have used. Google has since acquired it. It's now incorporated, I think, into Google Maps. And so I spoke with the founders a number of years ago, and this is a very uniquely Indian problem. So the problem here is that Indian trains don't run on time, which is problematic both for people in the train because you don't know when you should set your alarm if it's an overnight train to get off, or if you're waiting on the platform for someone to receive someone, you don't know when it'll show up. And so what they did is built an application that tracks based off of communication with the cell phone tower and all the phones on the train, where the trains are likely to be. And so they'll use clustering and like inference to kind of figure out where the trains are. And then if you're on the train, you can then set your alarm to wake you up at a certain stop at the right time. Or if you're receiving someone, they'll tell you when the train is likely to come. So kind of a very innovative problem, and it's very India specific because in the U.S. there's traveling by train, and we don't have a good rail network here. Europe does, but Europe the trains actually run on time. So it's a very kind of India specific problem and defensible in that regard. Another company here, this is called Awaz. They are they are building an application for banks. So banks to provide loans and often to like the bottom of the pyramid. So these are people who may not actually be literate themselves or have access to like a computing interface, and so they're building basically a voice agent that can interact with folks in a very scalable manner across all the different Indian languages. So someone to apply for a loan, they're now they now have to pay their loan installments, and to remind them on the collection side to pay those loan installments, they have a voice agent that can go call them, remind them, but it's not just canned messages. It'll actually interact with them and provide them with help and advice and help negotiate that process. And they've shown actual significant increases in the collections rates for some of these banks using this technology. Whereas previously, you'd have to employ a large workforce of people, which just doesn't make economic sense for the segment and tiers that some of these banks are targeting. Another example here that launched recently that you may have heard of. This is two. This is Pranav Mistri's company. He used to be with the MIT Media Lab. This is more on the AI infrastructure side, but I'm pretty excited about this. They're building kind of AI capabilities for many Indian languages, and this is like indigenously developed. And this is, I think, defensible because it's unlikely that the kind of large U.S. companies will focus on this immediately anytime soon, and I think they can build differentiation here in the meanwhile. And then this is a spin-off off of Ola that you may be familiar with, kind of a high-profile spin-off where they're doing both the hardware and the LLM side. So excited about this on the AI infrastructure side for India and building those capabilities. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the Indian startups that I'm excited about, and I'm sure there's a lot more. As I mentioned, I'm not intimately familiar with the Indian ecosystem, so I'm not as familiar with like some of the startups on the ground that are actually kind of penetrating the zone of infeasibility here. I just kind of using this framework tried to brainstorm some examples of AI Indian startup opportunities. So the first are companies, startup ideas for using AI to penetrate like the US market, for example, to make traditional enterprise apps accessible to small and medium businesses where they have not previously been able to perform such operations. So example would be like ERP software like SAP. You can imagine like a more simpler version for resource planning for small and medium businesses. CRM software, but using AI to automatically update the data entry, which is a very kind of tedious task, and going down market there, BI analytics, supply chain management, human resource software. So all these types of learning management systems, all these types of software have good adoption in enterprise, but they're hard to use, hard to adopt. And I can imagine an AI-enabled version with a lot of assistance that makes it very easy for people to onboard and use, and is lower cost that an Indian startup could develop and penetrate kind of the non-enterprise to market segments. And so if you notice, none of these are like uniquely Indian opportunities, but these are things that I think Indian company can have a global presence with. The other bucket are high functionality things that provide high functionality for casual users using AI. So this is kind of like moving upwards on the graph that I talked about the zone of infeasibility. And so you can imagine AI startup helping with legal document creation for farmers, so they don't have to talk to a lawyer. Rural home construction, automatically generating CAD designs and kind of very India-specific architectural designs and preferences here. Crop management and yield prediction, local language content creation, custom fashion design for local tailors using generative AI models, or for example, like land registration, property dispute resolution using generative AI. So these are all, I think, very India-specific problems where generative AI could help, and it would be defensible against like kind of a U.S. company coming in and trying to tackle these. So the commonality is they enable casual users to perform these tasks without an expert or power user. And then the third bucket here are providing convenience for power users. So power users already are doing these tasks, but how can we use AI to make it more easy for them? So a few examples are automated compliance for Indian tax laws, so it's helping accountants do this, land dispute resolution, but it's rather than enabling a landowner to do this, it's helping the lawyer do this in a more efficient manner. Microfinance loan risk assessment for risk assessment officers, energy grid management, supply chain optimization for kind of small businesses. So they're already doing it, but how can AI help with that? Or healthcare diagnosis as well. So the commonality here is that again, it's helping experts or power users do their jobs more easily. Something they're already doing, but AI greatly helps you. So, in conclusion, I think there's a bright future for Indian AI startups, both for applications and the AI infrastructure layer. At the infrastructure layer, I think there's room to build indigenous foundation models rather than relying on U.S. companies to develop them. And then I think more exciting on the application layer side, the opportunity I think is twofold. One is to build applications that do was previously infeasible for unique problems for the Indian market. And the second is to build easy to adopt applications that were previously infeasible to do now that you have AI, but they address the global market overall. So that is it for my talk.